And we are the Coalition, loud and proud, outrage porn-free, civilly disobedient media, broadcasting live on the Worldwide Coalition Network here at the GoLocal Live Broadcast Center, deep in the heart of the city we love, Providence, Rhode Island. Facebook.com/The Coalition Radio, on the mighty Twitter at Coalition_radio, and of course the mothership at CoalitionRadio.us. We'll have plenty of news out. We're doing a regular podcast on Spreaker now, but more about that later. We've got a very special guest on the line. His time is limited. He does have an appointment, but he's chosen to spend some time with us on this Friday evening. He is a repeat offender of the Coalition. He goes back all the way back to the earliest days of the show. Of course, he is Jared Moffett, who is, at least for the time being, well, he's always been the most interesting man alive, but now he's chosen to spend time again here in Rhode Island working on cannabis as an issue. Now, I want to set a few ground rules here for tonight. Who's joining the show afterwards is someone who's going to provide sort of a counterpoint. I think a balanced, intelligent conversation is going to take place, something that seems to have eluded the media on this issue so far. First off, that Jared Moffett is not the author of this law. He, like everyone else in the advocacy community, is simply reacting to it with their own take, as it were. The Marijuana Policy Project supports Regulate Rhode Island, and in doing so has, over a number of years, provided their own legislation, only to be sadly rejected by the state of Rhode Island, and in doing so have made incredible efforts to find some type of ground on legislation where it seems to be none can exist here in Rhode Island. The second point is we're not going to relive the brutalities of the war on drugs. Jared and I and our next guest, John Fennessy, are in complete agreement on the abject failure of the war on drugs and the deleterious impacts it's had on society at large. Tonight, our focus for the next hour, about a half hour or so from Jared and a half hour or so from John Fennessy, is to talk simply about the legislation that exists before us. So, Jared, without further ado, as they say in legitimate showbiz, welcome back to the Coalition, and give us just a brief synopsis of what you're doing now. You're covering a wide swath of territory for MPP. Give us a little background.
Sure. Yeah. Well, thanks for having me back on, and it's always great to talk with you. So I'm working for the Marijuana Policy Project. Rhode Island is one of our big priorities, but I'm also working on some other states, possible ballot campaigns in 2020. But what our focus is in Rhode Island is, I think, number one, we do generally support what the governor is doing, and I hope everyone sort of understands that including legalization in the budget is farther than this issue's ever gotten in terms of legislation in Rhode Island. And so we have a lot of concerns about the way it's written, a lot of really significant objections to certain provisions in there and certain things that aren't in there. But we are hoping that the process moves along because ultimately, if the budget article that she's put in, is removed, then we're back to square one. We're back where we've been in every year prior, which is no movement on this issue. So the way we're trying to balance this is a little nuanced. We want to, generally support the legislation, but at the same time, we want to also prepare a push to have amendments made. And so we're working on both fronts. And that's, I'm sure we'll dig into a lot more detail as we go along.
Okay, fair enough. Now, as you're aware, because you've had, despite your international travels on behalf of some super secret governmental agency or some sort, you could tell that people are pretty upset about, well, everything at this point in Rhode Island. Without obsessing over process, because I want to get to the legislation itself, quite frankly, activists on a number of areas are not happy, if you will, that this is part of the budget. And I'll explain to you our perspectives. First of all, we don't feel like this will be treated independently, if you will, as a separate issue because it's going to be folded in the budget. We feel that a lot of people will end up voting for something because they've got something else in the budget that they want to support. Many of the activists, and this is true whether you're a 2A person, whether you're a right to life person, regardless of that, are fearful of this new tack that the Raimondo administration is taking because you won't have as much oversight potentially in committees, a number of issues. Calm their fears, or if you will, why do you think it's better to go through the budget?
Well, I think it makes the legislature take the issue seriously. Because on the one hand, they can't simply just take the budget article out of the budget without doing some work to fill in the hole that's created by the revenue from the marijuana piece of it. So that's probably one of the major reasons why we see the budget as a good thing, as a vehicle to get this further than it's ever gone. Because they can't just throw it out. They've got to deal with it. They've got to come up with a way to fill the hole if they decide they don't want to go forward with it. Second, I think that when you're looking at the budget, you tend to get a bit more focused on the specifics of it and on the policy side, which is where we've been trying to move the legislature for several years now. Instead of just having the same old debate about should marijuana be legal or not, where we've tried to get people's attention is to talk about how it should be legalized, because we've felt for a long time that that's a more important and timely question. And then I think the third thing is just the simple fact that the governor has included this in her budget is an indication that she's supporting it, of course. I mean, it's sort of an endorsement from her. And this is the first time we've seen a major politician or lawmaker, embrace the issue. And so that alone gives the issue more momentum than we've had before.
Which brings us to the next step. And by definition, if in fact the justification for keeping it in the budget is that it's a revenue item, if you could address from your perspective the notion that every single item that comes along the pike, if you will, whether it be sports betting, whether it be cannabis, whether it be, women's rugby, seemingly, the state feels that it needs to have some level of participation, i.e. taxes, i.e. fees, some of them potentially quite onerous, in that. How does, and I'm not asking you to justify this for the government, but largely a lot of the marketing surrounding the legalization of cannabis has been around budgetary issues. And it's a plan. It just is. Why does the government feel, and why do people feel that there's an entitlement on behalf of the government to participate in the cannabis market or any market at large every time something comes along the pike? Why can't the government just keep their hands off of it?
Yeah, well, I think there's two answers to that. One is that it's just simple, self-interest on the government's part. They see that they can, raise a tax that's not going to affect everyone. So I think when they have an opportunity to generate revenue from a source that, isn't going to affect everyone or affect even a majority of people, and in fact, even of the people that use cannabis, there's a large portion that tends to use a lot more than everyone else. So I think that, there's just the cynical sort of, kind of attitude within government that, okay, hey, this is an easy way to kind of politically get away with raising taxes. So, I don't think that that's particularly, that's not a good motivation necessarily, but it's there. And, we have expectations that the government's going to do certain things. And obviously, we have political and ideological debate about that. But, there's an expectation that the government's going to fund a lot of things. And so they do, feel pressure to create revenue for that. This year, there looks like there's going to be a pretty significant hole that they have to fill. So that makes this issue look attractive. The second reason is, I think, from a public health perspective, we would not say that cannabis is totally, free of all risk or any harm. There are some risks involved. There are some public health issues in that. Certainly less than alcohol, certainly safer relative to alcohol. But nonetheless, when you have a substance that carries some risk, there's an argument to make that taxing it is important to keep the price from, going totally down to the floor, because once the price is lowered, use tends to go up, especially among young people and especially among users who might be considered problematic users. We see that with alcohol as well. If you lower alcohol taxes, what tends to happen is young people tend to use more, and people who already have problems with drinking tend to drink more. So that's not necessarily an argument for having a 20% tax, as the governor's budget would do. I think that the reasoning behind that is they want to match what Massachusetts has done. So that's probably, that's all the logic is there. But I think those are the two reasons. It's an attractive way to raise revenue without hitting everyone, and there's a public health reason as well.
Okay, so it's no secret to folks in the cannabis community, two things. Number one, that you've done a great deal to professionalize the approach to legalization, and for that, regardless of how we all may feel on some individual issues, we owe you a debt of gratitude. But at the same time, you're also, one of your hallmarks is that you're very well educated. And as just a fundamental economics, and I'll even use the term economic justice, as the government continues to absorb greater and greater pieces of the free market, it does so to the detriment of the potential growth of the free market, and it does so at the expense of the overall growth of the economy. So as the government keeps getting it handed to everything, as government keeps, let's just say, enabling central planning of the use of any one product, it actually has impact in a number of different areas. And at a certain point, Rhode Island's decision to have this type of central planning over a significant part, if you will, of the retail/entertainment function of the industry, whether it be gambling now, whether it be cannabis, whether it be sin taxes, whatever, does no one any good, and there is no incentive whatsoever to exert any sort of control or any sort of discipline on spending. This administration, and you don't live here anymore, so this isn't your fault, and you certainly were never part of the government, but this administration, to use the word profligate in terms of spending would be an understatement. And they've done it in areas that haven't created wealth, they haven't increased infrastructure spending, without the addition of extra taxes. So the additional tax base largely goes to supporting this sort of 1%, in the Soviet term, apparatchik-based economy, where a handful of people get wealthy off of the government. So as someone who's very, very well educated, do you see the issue there or the challenge there?
Yeah, I mean, I can understand that. That's a little, beyond what we're focused on, as a marijuana policy reform organization. But yeah, I mean, I can understand the frustration. I mean, and I told someone this after the hearing that I spoke with. If there was a viable political route to having a legalization bill passed that had lower taxes, that's not something we're at all opposed to. We're not in favor necessarily of having high taxes on this, or necessarily any significant taxes. So we're trying to advance our policy issue. We're not enough of a force to determine who wins and loses races in the General Assembly. So we can't really, our issue is not. It doesn't have enough salience really to say, okay, well, we're going to go all for what exactly we want. I mean, the reality is we have to make some compromises in order to advance our issue. And, so that's just the reality of where we are. But I can understand, that there's definitely a legitimate debate to have about what should be taxed and what rates things should be taxed and what that kind of leads to within government. So, I'm representing MPP right now, and, that's, when I'm wearing that hat, I don't really tend to take on an ideological position on the size of government and so on, because we try to just stay focused on our policy realm.
Right. So let's get to the legislation itself then, if you will. What do you like? What don't you like? What are your concerns? You mentioned that using the political process to use amendments, sub-A's, sub-B's. There's a whole lingo that goes to the sausage making that occurs up on as we call it, Mordor. Let's start with what don't you like about the bills?
Yeah, so there's several things that we're concerned about. So number one is that I do worry about the medical marijuana aspect and how it's going to affect patient access and affordability. The way it's written right now is that in order to continue having the right to grow your own or to appoint a caregiver to grow for you, a patient's going to have to demonstrate their need. And there's no definition provided in the legislation of what that means. It's going to be determined by regulators. And, you know, that's pretty concerning to us because if you have a rigid definition of need, then it's possible that we could see a lot of patients lose their ability to grow or to have a caregiver. And, you know, what I've tried to explain to the governor's office and the people working on this is, you know, we've had this program since 2006, and, you know, there was an amendment passed in 2009 to open up dispensaries, but those dispensaries didn't open up until 2013. And, of course, as many, you know, of us know, there continues to be only 3 dispensaries in the entire state. So what I'm getting at is that for the 13 years that the program's been around, the home grow and caregiver aspect has been really the lifeline that patients have depended on. And, you know, further on top of that, it's a source for many patients of affordable medicine and particular types of products that work well for them that may not be available at the compassion center. So, you know, I think it's a lot to ask, frankly, of the patients to, you know, simply trust the regulators and trust the market that it's going to, you know, produce plenty of safe, affordable access and the types of medicine that they need when, you know, for the 13 years we've had the program, it hasn't. I think that's asking a lot of patients to take on faith. So we're very concerned about that, and we don't frankly see a need to put this in. You know, there haven't really been that many problems with the home grow, although there's been a lot of sensationalization of you know, certain incidents. The other thing we're concerned about related to that is just the absence of any allowance for home grow under the adult use program. Mm-hmm. Again, we don't see the logic of that. We don't see the reasoning for, you know, preventing adults from growing their own, especially given that every state that has legalization, except Washington, does allow home cultivation. Right. So, you know, there haven't been any significant issues in Colorado as far as the small home grows. You know, their regulated market is still doing quite well. They're bringing in, you know, business. They've almost eliminated the black market. The illicit there. So, you know, I have this argument that this is going to be some type of, you know, public health problem or public safety issue, which is what the governor's office is claiming. So, yeah, those are kind of going together. Another big issue we have is let me jump
in on that for a second, because the single biggest sticking point outside of the philosophical discussion and then ultimately the size and monetary discussion around taxes is in fact the home grow. Nothing, if you look at the variety of folks who are affected by this, of course we're talking about folks who've been, you know, members of the medical issue, for whom home grow, we had Ms. Smith here on who's a noted activist locally for this, and she spoke quite poignantly, but also quite articulately about the importance of individual strains and their availability for people who are involved in home grow and who are involved intimately in the medical cannabis program. So not only do you have the issue of affordability and the size of the available supply being an ongoing concern, but you've actually got the components of the supply being of an acute nature for people who are involved in medical cannabis or using the program. It's well-established science. In fact, in an area where well-established science is difficult to get to because of the war on drugs and because of how cannabis is scheduled, it's well-established science that there are individual strains of medical cannabis that are particularly effective to particular situations. And home grow, for many of these folks, is not only just a liberty statement or a statement of philosophy, but quite frankly, it's an issue of survival.
Right. Yeah, I agree. I agree with you.
And the fact that and this is me, I will editorialize from time to time, and this is not a reflection or the sentiment of our guests. I'm not going to speak on behalf of either our guests, but the tone deafness, if you will, that the governor's office, after 5 years of being in power, towards, I don't even call these subtleties or nuances anymore. I just call these components of the program, is staggering to me. I don't know for the life of me why this governor continues to obsess over, for lack of a better term, I won't go poetic here, for screwing with the medical cannabis program, because quite frankly, it's a success. For the life of me, there, outside of some anecdotal sensationalizations and the odd case here or there of someone abusing the system, it's, by Rhode Island's governmental standards, a remarkable success. And that's, I'm not even talking about the humanity of the program. I'm talking about simply, just the efficiency with which it's run. Now, to your point about the number of dispensaries, this is a lot of folks, and this speaks to the entire issue here. A lot of folks' frustration with the medical program per se is that we saw this, when passed, as a gateway eventually to legalization. We did not see established financial powers within the dispensary system seizing upon their, I'll call it monopoly for lack of a better term, there's 3 of them, upon a significant revenue stream. We did not see that clearly as a roadblock. So the fear here is that we're going to pass this law, and we're all for supporting amendments to make it better. But this law is going to get passed, and it will be like everything else in Rhode Island, become, when government chooses to, set in stone. But let's get to some, okay, so and I know our time is limited, and this is, you and I have spent hours and hours discussing this in the past. Some of the cost components in terms of taxation at the retail level for folks who are involved in what you call adult use. Reflect on that versus what you've seen through the prism of MPP across the nation, what's successful and what hasn't been successful, and what's a roadblock for it to be successful.
In terms of the governor's proposal?
Yeah, I mean, in other words, you've got a situation in California right now, which is becoming a national model for how not to legalize. I mean, it's a program which is, by all accounts, even the independent media has picked up on how few cities have truly adopted an open program, how little revenue has come in for the government, how little weed's being sold for the entertainment level. Are these taxes and the fees that she's presenting, are they reflective of what's happening nationally, or do you find them to be egregiously high?
No, they're, to be fair, I mean, they are relatively, in the middle of the pack, so to speak. I don't think they're the lowest of the low, but they are on the lower end as far as taxes. Again, the unusual thing is the lack of home grow. That's, only Washington does that. There's another component that, that's a really important issue to me, which is the lack of social equity and any sort of policies or provisions that address the historical injustices of prohibition, particularly how it's affected low-income and communities of color. And, again, there's other states that I think have done a better job with that. California actually being one of them, I think that, has a fairly good working model of what they're doing to try to include folks in the industry and also, take some of the revenue and invest it into the, places that were, hardest hit by prohibition. Mm-hmm. The other thing I do have to say is that, again, we're not trying to praise the governor's proposal here in any type of holistic way. We have, big issues with it. But I do think that many of the technical issues in terms of regulating it, I think they've done a decent job, a pretty good job, actually, of looking at what's working in other states to avoid, there's no cap on how many licenses, which is something that, has been talked about before, but that's not in here. There's no local host agreements, which they had in Massachusetts, which have caused delays in licensing. There's no, there is a requirement that businesses have to be majority owned by Rhode Islanders until I think 2023 to promote, folks from within the state to be in the industry. So it's a mixed bag. I wouldn't praise everything in there, but I think that as far as the the regulatory scheme that's set up, I think it's pretty good. But we're still learning as well. So that's the case isn't in on or the data's not all in on other states as well. So we're still learning a lot.
But now on top of that, there's discussions, and you were up there. We were up there on two other issues very well into the late evening the night before. You were up there in terms of limitations on THC and on limitations on other components of how it's manufactured, medibles, edibles, all of that. Does that leave us at a competitive disadvantage, say with the looming Connecticut legislation as well as now established Massachusetts law?
Yeah, so I think with the potency, they're still going to allow the high potency stuff in the medical program, and I think all they're doing by limiting potency in the adult use market is you're driving people to either A, leave the state, as you're suggesting, to go and buy it in, Connecticut or Massachusetts, or you're encouraging people to, get a medical license when, it's become easy, frankly, to do it because now they allow out-of-state doctors. And, some people, are a little bit on the margins, so to speak, in terms of whether they qualify, but they can still get a license. So I think you're encouraging people to circumvent the adult use market by limiting potency. So I get what they're trying to do. They're trying to win over some public health people. They're trying to, package this as the most responsible, legalization measure. But I don't think it's really going to accomplish the goal that they want. I don't see it as a huge issue, frankly. It's not in our top priorities of things that we're trying to fix, but I don't think it's a particularly good idea.
Well, I mean, because ultimately, to me, the fear is that we'll simply drive people, at least on an anecdotal basis, is happening in California, back to the quote-unquote alternative marketplace, where you will start to see some of the same issues that arose during said war on weed, war on drugs, and you'll start to see the same behavior, and you'll have the worst of all worlds, and you'll have this burdensome regulatory environment. You'll be again, and Ms. Smith put it very aptly when she said every year people in the medical cannabis program, many of whom are, as you know, face acute physical challenges, now have to wake up once a year to the mental challenge of saying, what are they going to try to do to us this year? And what do I have to do to maintain the existing program? And the question always being, why do I have to fight this war once every year or two with the governor's office? So, to us, to folks right now who stand in opposition to the bill, we face two challenges, and I know you probably only have a couple minutes left, but maybe you can address this. Number one, we're veterans of what we thought was going to be a gateway to full adult use, which was the inception of the medical program. And we've realized now that compromise is often the devil, because it's been very difficult with this administration, once law is established, to roll things back. And believe me, we're trying on a couple of levels. It's very, very difficult. You've got a government that's addicted to taxes, and you've got a governor who's addicted to, quite frankly, polishing her resume for future national office. So we've been burned once before. And then the problem is that when you look at the totality of these defects, then understanding that you've got to approach it not through a single bill, but through a budgetary process, which compromises a lot of the philosophical integrity of many members of the House, because they just want to get the budget passed. All right, it just seems like it's a very difficult road to hoe to swallow this. Yet at the same time, we want the same thing you want, which is full legalization. What would you say to those people in closing?
Yeah. So I'm going to have to jump off after this, but so I understand that, but I also would say these are issues that are, again, bigger than marijuana policy. I can't, none of us can fix, what you guys are talking about in terms of the problems with the Rhode Island government. I would say that, I don't know what the alternative here is, because if we oppose the entire thing and we just say, no deal, then I don't see how that helps. I mean, this is moving forward, not just, in Rhode Island, around us, right? All around the region, all around the country. And frankly, the longer, we wait, I think we have even less of position to influence what the legislations look like. There's going to be more and more over time industry players that want to shape how the law looks, that are going to come in and, unfortunately, this isn't a good thing, but some of the industry players aren't in favor of home grow. They see it as a threat to their market. So I think that we actually do have a good chance to push for these amendments. I mean, I was at the hearings and there was support, or at least, critical questions about why not allow home grow? Why are we giving any of these unfair advantages to the existing compassion centers? Why is the tax rate so high on CBD products? So I'm more optimistic, I guess. I think there is a chance to make this a much better bill, and that's what we're going to try to do. I don't see any use, frankly, in just being straight up opposed to it. Okay,
you've got to go. I know that Jared Moffitt with the MPP, Marijuana Policy Project, of course, the long-term player in Regulate Rhode Island. Jared, let's check in a couple of weeks and we'll see how things are going. Okay.
That sounds great. Thanks so much.
Thanks for joining us. Again, we're going to take a quick break now, but that was Jared Moffitt, truly on the front lines, if you will, of this legislation. We're going to take a quick break right now. We're going to ask John Fennessy to come on the line and provide kind of a counterpoint. John Fennessy is a longtime liberty activist in the state and has taken quite an interest in this, has been following this very closely. It's a compelling question. There's an old cliche, an old question out there, is when is very good, is that the enemy of perfect? As I mentioned, without belaboring the fact, I have very, very mixed opinion. On the other hand, if political pressure can be brought to bear to take this and create something workable out of this legislation, clearly all in favor of it. And that's where, quite frankly, you come in. Whether you're listening to this tonight live or you hear this on a podcast in the coming days or you hear it discussed, number one, we would hope you would take a few moments out and, rid yourself of the reefer madness and the nonsense that's floating about, particularly on talk radio and particularly on the general media. What's horrifying to me is that this is an issue that's been discussed for years now. This has been in the public arena since really the inception of the medical cannabis program. The notion that many members of the media would be, let's be blunt, ignorant to even the most basic facts, understanding, say, a difference between THC and cannabinoid, it's horrifying. It seems like a great deal of the media does their homework by listening to their listeners or readers in comment sections. That stupidity has to stop. Case in point, this week, folks were talking about, how are we going to have a job force? How are we going to have a workforce? Well, established law, in fact, the attorney was a guest on the show last year. The Callahan case, as supported by your American Civil Liberties Union, based here in Rhode Island, established as law the notion that you cannot have employment discrimination against members of the medical cannabis program. The fact that people are out there quoting job losses or job issues as a potential offset of that, it's just, I'll just call it what it is. It's media. Let's keep it clean here. But anyway, we're going to take a quick break right now. You are, in fact, listening to The Coalition on the Worldwide Coalition Media Network here at the GoLocal Live Broadcast Center, deep in the heart of the city we love, Providence, Rhode Island. Facebook.com/The Coalition Radio. On the mighty Twitter at Coalition_radio. On those links, we're going to blast out our new podcast link on Spreaker, where you can download just simple audio of this, and you can listen to some real thought leaders who joined the coalition here in Rhode Island, who are not guilty of the sort of editorial and reporting malfeasance, laziness, ignorance that is so pervasive in the mainstream media. If I sound harsher than most, it's because, well, it's starting to impact the state. Economic ignorance of the basic issues, we can't tolerate that from our media anymore. So if you want to listen to the dumbed down stuff, you can, but do so at your own risk. And then you can come here and do a fact check. So, Facebook.com/The Coalition Radio, on the mighty Twitter at Coalition_radio, and of course the mothership at coalitionradio.us. I want to take a brief moment to absolutely thank Daryl Gould, airsciences.net, for sponsoring this segment. Airsciences.net bringing mold remediation, biohazard fighting in your home, your workplace, the schools. This time of year we start to get a sense of where we are with moisture and flooding and the mold that can be impacted. airsciences.net, based here in Little Rhodey, licensed, insured, ready to do the work to make your life and your lifestyle safer. So folks, stay tuned. We'll be right back. And we are back. We are the Coalition, loud and proud, outrage porn free, civilly disobedient media. Tonight we're continuing our focus on cannabis legislation that's before the Rhode Island General Assembly. It's quite controversial. This is the first year that Gina Raimondo has decided to incorporate it in her budget. The guest that was just on, Jared Moffat, no stranger to the Coalition, a good friend of mine. We agree and disagree on certain issues. Took a higher road than I probably would, more positive road, and pointed out that the advantage of it being in the budget, if you will, was the ongoing need to pass said budget. In a sense, making the revenue integral to the overall budget forecast, responsible for the passage of said budget. I personally am a little frustrated by that. I don't feel it's going to get the oversight that this legislation so desperately needs. So we asked someone to come on as a counterpoint. Again, I want to point out that neither parties involved are actively involved in the generation of this legislation. Our first guest, Jared Moffat, works for MPP, Marijuana Policy Project, and has been involved in Regulate Rhode Island now for several years. Our next guest is John Fennessy. John has been associated with a number of liberty causes along and around the state of Rhode Island for a number of years right now. Instrumental, if you will, from the liberty perspective in fighting for it on behalf of your Second Amendment rights. Also, as a part of member of the Liberty RI, the Libertarian Party of Rhode Island, and is his own self-liberty activist, self-described. He's been involved intimately in following the legislation surrounding the ongoing war on drugs, whether it be the medical cannabis legislation and now yet another attempt to make cannabis legal. He's joined us before, so he now officially qualifies as a repeat offender. John, thanks for coming on tonight. Welcome to the Coalition.
Hey, Pat. Thanks for having me on.
All right, so I imagine you were hearing what Jared had to say.
Yes, I tuned in.
Okay, so what are your thoughts? I mean, let's take the legislation at large. You and I have known each other for several years, and I always talk about incrementalism being the devil, based on our experiences with the Medical Cannabis Project. What are your thoughts about this? Is it time just to pass a law, or do we just need to do a better job of getting it right?
Pat, I don't like doing it just to do it. I respect what Jared does and, some of his opinions, as especially as it relates to protecting patients from this god-awful proposal. The fact that the governor is yet again targeting sick people for revenue generation, it once again demonstrates, the lack of heart that this administration, routinely demonstrates. The legislation as a whole, I think just to say, this is the furthest we've ever gotten, and if we just say no to it, then, maybe we don't get an opportunity. I don't think that's the reality. It's coming. If it doesn't come this year, so be it. We shouldn't be saying yes to something that's restrictive just for the sake of doing it, because then we put up barriers to undoing. And as you know, Pat, you've alluded to this in the past. Once a tax or a regulation is passed in Rhode Island, it's set in stone. We live with it. It doesn't go anywhere. So if we're going to pass a bill in Rhode Island just to pass it, we're going to end up with something that in the future we're regretting. We're trying to get the tax lowered, or to, if we end up settling for, having home grows with limitations, are we ever going to be able to move those limitations, down the field a little bit so that we're getting a little more freedom? I don't think this bill represents freedom at all. I think it represents a money grab by the state so that they can control the cannabis market in a way that, if this proposal goes through as is, no state has ever taken this much control over cannabis. So what it represents to me is the state taking control of something that for 100 years they told us was the devil, and now it's okay because we're going to make money off of it. But in the meantime, we've really gained no more freedoms. We can't grow it in our homes. We can't, you can't possess, or you can't purchase an edible over a certain amount. There's just, at what point do you just allow adults to be adults and not micromanage the way they choose to live their lives on all fronts, not just with cannabis?
I often posit that we live in something called a permission society, where government has taken our rights, and we now have to, as we jokingly refer to in libertarian circles, if I may approach the throne, may I have permission to use some of my natural-born rights? And by the way, this is a state where a great deal of hay was made just 2 weeks ago about the right to control one's body. Do you see hypocrisy in any of those two issues?
I see hypocrisy every time I look at Rhode Island state government. Mm-hmm. So on those two issues, yes, and on several others.
So the overall notion that we need to pass a law because we need to pass a law, you're willing to look government square in the eye and say no, because you need passage. You need to be completed, if you will, right? You need to understand that whatever becomes the quote unquote law, and you and I have equal respect for the law. Whatever though becomes the law for the rest of the state, shall I qualify it that way, needs to incorporate liberty, doesn't it?
Well, in order for me to I don't want to say sign off on it, because I don't see Rhode Island at this point in time anyway as the state that's going to treat cannabis the way it should be treated, which is as medicine, as produce, as a plant. And it almost, when you say, a plant is a plant, it's almost getting tired at this point. And it's not because the point isn't true. A plant is a plant. The reason it's become a tired argument is because we've been saying it for 10, 15, 20 years. Right. The Democrats are Johnny-come-lately on this issue, just like they were on marriage equality. Mm-hmm. So they haven't been fighting the fight for, since the 70s, like the libertarians have. They've adopted a way to regulate and legalize cannabis that is consistent with their philosophy, which is to take government and use it to regulate and tax the crap out of everybody. They don't just do it on cannabis. This is what we're seeing here, but they want to do it with guns. They do it with everything. Ironically, there are a couple of things in Rhode Island that we don't tax, and those things are medicine and produce, both of which would describe cannabis. Cannabis is a medicine and also a produce. Mm-hmm. So, even in a state where we view people as little more than tax cattle, we don't tax medicine and produce. So this idea that we need to tax cannabis in order to fill some budget gap, that's the wrong reason to do this if I've ever heard it. I don't believe that the state needs more money. I think the budget is egregious. I don't think it's better that this is a budget issue rather than standing on its own as legislation, because it has basically boiled it down to the state grabbing money, and freedom is clearly taking a back seat here. So I think even if you, as a libertarian, I would prefer a 0% tax rate. Just the way we hear Governor Raimondo talk about jobs and economic growth, certainly she'd be willing to trade government funding for massive economic growth and job growth in the state. Right. Even if you didn't tax it at all, it would still lead to good things for the state, things that she says daily she cares about, when clearly all she cares about is putting a tax on cannabis for regular people, and then also through ending these medical marijuana grows. It's clearly the only reason you would want to do this is to force medical patients to go to a dispensary and pay a tax on the cannabis. There's no other reason that you would want to do that. Right. So the fact that we are once again balancing the budget on the backs of sick people like we did with the plant tags is just despicable. And I know I've said it before, and I'll continue to say it. It's one of the most disgusting acts I've ever seen from any public official ever. Right.
No, absolutely no doubt about it. And it's time for us to call government on it. If we mince words, if we enter these chambers, eyes cast downward, and again beg for the state for permission for our own rights and our own personal safety, then we've lost. If we demand, and I mean demand, this issue, particularly on the medical side, is one of those lines in the sand, isn't it? Where if we give this up, there's virtually nothing left. They want to tax and take away our guns. They want to tax and keep away our weed. And your point on economics is very well made. I mean, you know, we're constantly listening to the patter of green jobs. Well, quite frankly, this is the first legitimate green jobs marketplace I've seen. You know, the notion that we could actually turn hemp into a cash crop here in parts of New England, southern New England, would be astonishing. That we can,
and that's why we're not in a position of weakness on this. We don't have to grovel as subjects to these people that have, you know, the government for, like I said, 100 years has treated this as though it's a gateway drug. And, you know, I remember being propagandized too in school, you know, as it related to cannabis. And, you know, all of a sudden, just like gambling, which I agree with gambling. I agree with, you know, consuming cannabis if that's what you want to do. But the fact that it's now profitable for them is the only reason they're interested in it. We're not in a position of weakness where it's not going to happen if it doesn't happen this year. It's a very lucrative product. Even at a 0% tax rate, it is a lucrative product because it's an economic lightning rod. You know, we don't have a lot going on in Rhode Island in terms of, you know, Main Street shops are empty. And, you know, you have your niche places that people like to go, but how many empty places do you walk by? There's no reason why we can't just allow this thing to happen without strict regulation and taxation. And we don't need more than a $10 billion budget to sort of say that we need to put this in place. And to do what? To have a $14 billion budget? Our budget is already twice that of New Hampshire's. They're 8 times our size. They have just as many people as we do. There's no need to initiate yet another money grab. And by the way, this isn't, Jared Moffett said, you know, it's a tax, but it's on, you know, the reason they want to do it. I'm not saying that he condoned it, but he ascribed their thought process on this to, well, it's an area where we can tax people and not a lot of people partake in it, so we're taxing a minority of people. Mm-hmm. Those people have already been taxed time and time again. It's always the same source. You're not changing the source. They're the same. It's the same person. I'm getting taxed when I buy this, that, and the other thing. So it's not like you're finding a new person to tax. You're just taxing someone to death.
Right.
And that's all we know how to do here.
And the beauty of this situation is that Connecticut and Massachusetts, if in fact we rebel against this, or I should almost say when we rebel against this, the burgeoning cannabis industries in Massachusetts and Connecticut will act like a vice grip on the economic, you know what, of Rhode Island. Because thanks to the miracle of the interstate highway system and services like Lyft and Uber, we can actually go up to Massachusetts, partake legally, and then return to our comfortable homes here in Rhode Island to feast. You know, guess what?
Or Pat, if we have a quasi-prohibitionist approach like this legislation represents, we're still going to have a black market. Mm-hmm. Mr. Moffett mentioned that the reason that you would want to tax it is because, I don't know if he was condoning this or just saying that this is what the governor wanted, but was to have price control so that usage wouldn't go up. You want to control the price.
Right.
Controlling the price has largely led to the black market staying in place because if you look at the taxes in Massachusetts, they're egregious. You can actually go get cannabis on the black market for 25, a quarter of the price of what you're paying in Massachusetts. So we don't even need Connecticut and Massachusetts taking away that business.
Sure.
We already have the black market doing that. And if we think we're going to use taxation as price controls, we're killing ourselves. We're kidding ourselves because that would mean that prohibition works, that prohibition that you put on cannabis that wasn't taxed, for some reason that worked. And the argument that we've been making for years is that it doesn't. So why does it all of a sudden work when it comes to having a prohibitionist version of legalization where you're going to prohibit certain activities and therefore you still have to enforce them?
Right.
And when that inevitably doesn't work, you have the black market satisfying those needs yet again. So if prohibition does not work, let's just knock it off.
Kill it. Absolutely kill it. And allow economic growth to happen, in this case, in an organic manner and allow people to experience the wealth that the private market generates instead of this increasingly desperate attempt by the state of Rhode Island to consume vast amounts of private enterprise in the private market space and the available consumer spending of the taxpayers here. It's doomed to failure on every level. We all know it is. So why do they persist? Is it just a desperate attempt to hold on to more and more of our money? We know how this movie ends, John. What do you think is their motivation?
I think they're only, they're only displaying the same behavior they always do, which is to give us this. When you compare it to what other states are doing, Rhode Island routinely gives us this bland, often restrictive version of what other places have going on, and they know that a lot of people are indifferent to it, or they'll say things like, we should do it just to do it. I mean, hey, it's better than what we have anyway, right? You can't go buy weed at all right now, so you might as well take this because it's in the budget, and if it doesn't go through, where will we be? Well, I suggest that if you don't like the taxes or you don't like I agree with Jared that we should try to change it. And if it doesn't change, there is absolutely no reason why any organization that is for the legalization of cannabis should be for this legislation if it doesn't severely change. Right. Because what it does is it codifies taxation and regulations that we all know is going to be virtually impossible to roll back. And we're saying we're willing to compromise with that now because we envision ourselves possibly rolling it back in the future. It's not going to happen. You're creating barriers for yourself to then go ahead and try to climb over in the future. It's not a recipe for long-term success to say, let's just do it because we don't know if we're ever going to have the opportunity. We clearly will have the opportunity. Rhode Island wants to legalize weed so that they can turn around and take tax revenue in. This will be, in one form or another, if it doesn't pass this year, this will be talked about every single year until it happens. I guarantee you that.
Right. They can't make it go away anymore. Try as they may. Nope. We were treated this week to the spectacle of the Raimondo-appointed police toadies all of a sudden coming into line and explaining why this would be good for the state.
Right. Of course they like it. It's prohibitionist legalization.
Right. And it was quite a sight to see, too, watching the very folks who've been a roadblock, the very folks who have been instruments of the war on drugs and are so personally responsible in many cases for the racism, the inequalities, the horrors, the jail terms, the grotesque infringement of rights.
And these police still know that they're going to be involved with legalization that looks like this.
Right.
Because what you're going to have is something that's unprecedented. You're going to have small businesses that might pop up to grow cannabis or sell cannabis. Those businesses are going to have to open their doors to law enforcement. They're not going to enjoy the same Fourth Amendment protections that most businesses, if not virtually all businesses in the state, enjoy. Mm-hmm. Pharmacies don't have police officers walking in their establishment twice a year to do an audit and to look around. So to have law enforcement enforcing business regulations is in and of itself a red flag. And the reason why, in my opinion, the state police would be okay with this is because they still have a hand in this. They're still being tasked with policing cannabis, even though we should be agreeing at this point that this isn't a job for law enforcement. We don't limit, when it comes to potency limits and purchase limits, which I'd love to talk about, because that in and of itself, you could talk about how you execute the purchase limits aspect all day. Mm-hmm. We have, part of this proposal is that you can only buy so much product over a certain period of time. Right. Are we honestly at this point in Rhode Island ready to undertake the creation of yet another database, with the goal being that it's allegedly critical that we track these plants? So we're going to do something we failed at just recently and are still failing at.
On so many different levels.
And how I want to know how often the governor is allowed to go to the liquor store, or how much liquor she's allowed to buy when she goes.
Right.
the adults should be able to purchase cannabis as often or, in whatever quantity they so choose.
Mm-hmm.
And in keeping with their focus on revenue, why would you want to turn away customers that are looking to buy things? You're going to limit people to buy something that you're taxing.
Mm-hmm.
And then you're going to, on the other end of things, cry poor mouth and say we need another tax when you're saying no to taxed revenue, taxable revenue.
Because it's a function of the same social engineering that they engage in with regards now to food. They want to engage in with weapons. They want to continue to engage with tobacco and other quote unquote, sin taxes. That's what they want to do.
Right.
They want really the best of both worlds.
Well, and they also want to use tax. And this was said during the gun hearings. I wish I had the guy's name readily available, but he was testifying on behalf of the state. He was a bureaucrat. These words actually came out of his mouth. We use tax policy to affect desired societal change. That's code for social engineering.
Right.
So they want to use taxation to change people's behavior. They want to, like Jared alluded to, they want to use it as price controls with cannabis. That's not going to work. You're just going to allow the black market to persist, which, by the way, is fine with me. The black market, to me, in most, as it relates to cannabis, where there's some crossover with harder drugs and gangs, there's some room for discussion there. But as it relates to cannabis, the black market has been very good to us.
The black market is nothing more.
It's only when the state tries to get involved that it becomes a mess. So if the black market doesn't go away, I'm not necessarily, crying in my soup.
Right. I mean, the black market is nothing more than a renaming of a retail market that has been forced to occupy and work under circumstances that some may disagree with because of artificial enforcement placed upon it by the state. The black market,
absolutely.
It's the question of how do you define a patriot versus a terrorist? Well, it depends what side you're on. If you're a consumer and you're looking for, quality weed, and you're an adult, you've probably got someone that you've been worked with for a number of years. You're not going to that street corner to score a dime bag, as they used to say back in my day. You're going out to someone that you've dealt with for a number of years that you trust. And that person just has to operate because of the stupidity of how we structure our government, has to operate, quote unquote, in an alternative marketplace. So I don't even call it the black market anymore. I call it the alternative market because it's just simply a different place for me to go buy goods and services that the state has decided that they're going to artificially weaponize, for lack of a better term. So I'm with you.
And all the things that are dangerous about the black market are because of the fact that the things involved are made illegal. So therefore, the criminal element is more likely to be handling them.
Right.
It's not that the market is free or that it's unregulated. It's that it's being targeted by law enforcement, and historically, organized crime has been able to combat that and serve the market. So if you eliminate the criminalization of this plant, what you're left with is, if you have a regulated market and you've overtaxed or overregulated things, you're left with a black market that is in essence free and not criminal. It's important for the state, as made clear by this legislation, that they're still involving the police at a level where you could still be considered a criminal if you're growing a bunch of plants in your house and supplying all your neighbors. They don't want to see that happening. That's them losing revenue.
Right, and the police in turn see that as an opportunity for budgetary growth, their own continued militarization, and quite frankly, their ability to continue their own profit center.
They see the drug war slipping away, and they don't want what you and I see as legalization to happen. They want this crap because they're still involved, they're still in charge, and they're still getting their funding. If it were up to you and I, Pat, they'd have nothing to say about cannabis other than I love it.
Yeah, I go home and I'm off for a couple of days. I use it myself, which, by the way, is more than likely happening, as we all know.
Yeah, I'm sure they do. After they steal it from somebody.
Well, there you go. They've got that. They've got their own supply chain. I think it's called an evidence locker. Hey now, folks need to viciously fight this, don't they?
Well, that's the point of free speech, is to, I can agree with Jared that Rhode Island is probably going to do one thing, that they're probably going to greatly restrict cannabis. I don't think Rhode Island is going to turn into a free utopia overnight, or at all. But I do think that if we just sit here and we allow them to dictate what's going to happen, and we're only willing to, if we're going to say, well, how about instead of no home grows, we have home grows with a limit? Mm-hmm. In my opinion, we should be letting the prohibitionists talk about the limits. We have free speech so that we can say things like, this is a plant, it's a human right, where do you draw the line on this human right? And so that drives that conversation in a certain direction. That's why we have free speech, so that we can take an argument and come to some sort of agreement, mm-hmm. or some sort of context to that discussion that's not just created by the government and their legislation. So if we all walk in that door and we say, yeah, well, that's bad, but how about a little bit less bad? We're going to get garbage every single time. If we walk in that door and we say, that's bad, here's what would be good, maybe we'll still end up with less bad. But then when we turn around next year and we fight less bad, we have credibility. We didn't stand there and say less bad was okay, and now we're here to say, no, it's not.
And if the ultimate happens that we have a worst-case scenario where most of this as-stated law goes through, I would argue then there's only one option on behalf of the citizenry, which is to ignore the very existence of that legalized channel. We effectively have to boycott it. We can't continue. I understand the exigent circumstances under which people who are members of the medical cannabis community operate. For them, it's very often literally a question of life and death, and the ability to really exist in society for so many of these people who are such chronic pain sufferers. I'm not going to question their decisions on any level. What I am going to say to people who are cannabis consumers is, if in fact these laws are passed as they are now, as egregious as they are, and we support in any way these channels as created by government, then we have no one to blame but ourselves. We must begin to strike at the financial heartbeat of the state itself in order to eliminate the state itself. The state relies ultimately on us to be producers for them. At that moment in time when we cease to do that, or even lower our demonstrated ability to do that, then the state suffers almost immediately. The state is a tumor. The government is a cancer. And I say that with respect to people who are physically challenged these days by some of those illnesses. I don't say that with a smirk or a smile. But ultimately, the government sucks the lifeblood out of all of us. And to the degree with which we support it through our hard efforts and our work, with this notion that somehow we're going to continue to be able to work from within, I think needs to begin to be challenged on a high level in whatever means necessary. And if we support this structure, this Frankensteinian structure that Governor Raimondo is going to inflict upon us, both perpetuate and perpetrate upon the citizenry, then we need to object. And the one way that we can object legally is with our pocketbook. Because the government ultimately needs us to spend millions of dollars at Twin River. The government needs us to spend money, over at Twin Riverton. The government needs us to buy cigarettes locally. The government desperately needs us to buy gasoline. The government will soon need us to purchase our cannabis through the state mechanism. That's how they survive. And we must find ways to end that supply chain to them. Because ultimately,
could you have an easier state to do that in?
That's what I'm saying.
We're talking about a state where you're never far from a border.
Right.
And they sit there and they puff their chest out like it's so easy, or like it's so hard for us to walk away and spend our money in Massachusetts. It's not hard at all. I live closer to a shopping center in Mass than I do in Rhode Island. Guess where I spend my money?
That needs to happen.
So to have some sort of ego of Rhode Island, we have the ocean, so we can treat people however we want, so they're going to want to come here because there's a nice view. Well, how far has that gotten us now?
Right.
We're constantly beating up businesses and beating up people that come to live here. Now there's a provision in this legislation where any cannabis business in Rhode Island has to be majority owned by a Rhode Islander. Are we really keeping people? We want people to move here and start businesses. Are we really putting things in legislation that stops them from doing that? While we're doing that stuff, they're simultaneously spending millions of dollars studying how to get people to come here. I'll give you the answer. I'll only charge you $5. Stop doing crap like that, and people will come here.
Pretty much. Yeah, it's interesting because you go down to the Caribbean and you attempt to do business in the Caribbean, and many of those states have those type of requirements. And it's one of the most insufferable parts of investing or working down there is the notion that the individuals by birth are accorded this special right of ownership. And the notion that we would do that here in Rhode Island in the year 2019, I mean, my God. It just shows how hopelessly bankrupt they are. I got to ask you a question. You're a hardcore purveyor of news. Without naming names, what's your opinion about how the media has been covering this?
I didn't catch what you just said.
What's your without naming names or really trying to point out individuals? What is your opinion of how the media has been covering this and similar issues here in Rhode Island?
I think in terms of the governor's legislation.
Yeah, in terms of the governor's legislation, understanding that some of the issues involved in economic development, understanding the issues involved in cannabis and the war on drugs. I mean, what's your overall grade of the general media here in the state of Rhode Island when it comes to nuanced issues like this? When it doesn't come to covering, someone's dog rescuing someone's cat, when it comes to not covering a car accident, when it comes to economic issues that require some study and research, how good a job does the media do in this state?
Well, I mean, I think, for the most part, I think they don't do a good job. They don't go, they don't try to get deep into an issue and kind of put it out there like you used to see from a lot of journalists. That's not to say there aren't journalists out there doing that. There are some great journalists out there doing that. Mm-hmm. The unfortunate reality is that talking about the economic implications of a feel-good idea doesn't get clicks. So if what gets clicks is the feel-good idea, not the,
right.
Take mandatory maternity leave as an example. Mm-hmm. That'll get you clicks because it feels good. Well, let's talk about the fact that now a company is less likely to hire a woman. Well, that doesn't get me clicks. I'm not gonna go there with it. And these are the conversations we need to have, the uncomfortable conversations. When someone says, let's tax cannabis at 20%, there needs to be someone there saying, let's tax it at 0%. Because if the only people that are standing there saying, let's tax it at 10%, then you're going to get 12 or 14. So we need to take the hardline position on issues. Rhode Island has never been more ripe for that kind of approach. Their continuous failure, and it always looks the same. The failure always looks exactly the same with this government. It's always a regulation, tax-heavy. I mean, the amount of new taxes in this budget is insane. Did you think a year, 2 years ago that they would be able to? I mean, you did. But they're so blatant about it now that they don't even care. They're just throwing the taxes out there like confetti, saying, don't worry about it. It's a minority of people. Well, 4 of these new taxes apply to me. So what do you mean it's 4, a minority of people?
Right.
What they're doing is they're taking us and they're breaking us up into minorities, gun owners, mm-hmm. marijuana users, medical marijuana users. And when they get us into a minority, they can stamp us out, they can tax us, and then, there's no chance in kind of getting that overturned because now you're a minority and you've done it just to do it.
Right. And we've broken broken down, I mean, by using identity politics like that to an extreme, we create all sorts of islands of people. We actually engender bigotry and hatred amongst the groups of people. We do everything that they claim not to. They do not bring people together. They exacerbate tension between people's economic levels, racial levels, whatever their needs levels are, and they essentially set one against the other.
Right.
You know, I always used to joke, I'm in favor of all taxes I don't have to pay. That went from being a joke to, for a lot of people, a reality. The concept being that if we're raising money on weed, and I don't smoke weed, and I've never smoked weed, you know, here's my personal irony. I haven't smoked weed in 30 years, and I haven't shot a gun in 40. What do I spend most of my time fighting for? You know, it's what I'm fighting for here is not just the initial issue, as you are. You're not fighting just for the initial issue. You're not taking it to the superficial. You're fighting the symptoms of what is ultimately the disease. And the disease is this unquenchable thirst that Rhode Island government has for growth. Growth at anyone's expense possible, by any measure possible, and by using this self-promoted, self-created sense of power to do so. Neither the sports betting app nor the sports betting casino-based system was voted on as required by the Rhode Island State Constitution. Because you now have, as you pointed out so aptly, you have a government that simply bowls through like the bull in the proverbial china shop and cares not for any of the implications, cares not for the rules, cares not for the rule of law, and will only be stopped if forced to be stopped. Other than that, the new mantra is just simply do it, and it's an old cliche. Ask for forgiveness, not for permission. Except they never bother around to even get to ask for the forgiveness. They simply just do it. And that's true of everything from tolling to some of the provisions in this new budget. Now, I've got you for a little bit more time, and I appreciate all the time you spent tonight. I couldn't not ask you about what's going on with the Second Amendment here in Rhode Island. What's your take on that?
Oof. Well, I mean, same deal. They're just trying to ram through any ridiculous thing they can think of.
Right.
And they hope that the Second Amendment community is asleep at the wheel, and clearly it's not. Mm-hmm. They came out in force at the State House the other day, over 3,000 gun owners to under 100 anti-Second Amendment types.
By the way, for the second time in less than a year. I mean,
right. Well, yeah, and it's you mentioned how medical marijuana patients have to constantly, year after year, go fight for, not being taxed to death. Mm-hmm. Second Amendment supporters and gun owners, every single year, sometimes multiple times a year, like you just mentioned, have to go to the State House and defend a right that is clearly enumerated in two constitutions. The Second Amendment of the U.S. Constitution and Article 1, Section 22 of the Rhode Island Constitution. The fact that we have to routinely defend something that is so clearly written. The Rhode Island's Constitution is much clearer than the Second Amendment when it comes to the right to bear arms. A lot of people that aren't for the right to bear arms, they often refer to the militia reference of the well-regulated militia in the Second Amendment. We don't have that language in the Rhode Island Constitution. Rhode Island's Constitution simply says the right to keep and bear arms, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. With that in mind, we should not have to constantly go up there and defend that right. We're at the point now where we've compromised so often on the right to bear arms, and the NRA is guilty of this. We have compromised so many times on the right to bear arms, it doesn't matter that it's written in stone anymore. It doesn't matter that they're not allowed to enact these laws. They're merely going to just hit us with a barrage of these things every year and hope that we're asleep at the wheel one time and something goes through. And then once something goes through in Rhode Island, it stays through.
And
it's hard to get the courts to overturn it, and it's hard to get enough people out to overturn it at the polls.
Right. I witnessed the red flag legislation of last year. I swore in front of that Judiciary Committee that the Libertarian Party was going to work to roll those back. and you could have heard the gasp in the room from the folks in the red shirts. It never even occurs to them that there might be anything but forward progress with their agenda. It's
Right.
a rollback of that law needs to be proposed in this session, and it needs to be heard in committee. It's just finding someone with the balls to do it, quite frankly. That's why Billy Hunt needed to get.
And this is another example of attacking a minority.
Mm-hmm.
Not minorities, but a minority of voters who feel a certain way on one issue. There are a lot of guns in the state. There isn't a majority of gun owners here. Mm-hmm. So the state thinks, well, if we throw these bills out there, we'll be okay. We can continue to do this, and we won't, because most people don't vote. We'll be able to turn out the vote and get a win for for our team, and then we can push whatever we want. It doesn't matter. We can appoint the judges. Rhode Island is a Democrat state through and through at every level, and so unless that changes, we get some independents, libertarians in. We're going to be stuck with this type of attitude that we are here to write law, and we will write law and impose it upon you, at every turn. I think referring to these people as lawmakers is a bit of a mistake, because we give them the idea that, we've elected them as lawmakers to go up there and represent us. You don't have to write laws. Seriously, there comes a point where we have enough laws. So maybe instead of writing a law, why don't we start submitting legislation to roll back laws we don't need, like prohibition of cannabis? Why do we have to have some big cumbersome legislation that legalizes cannabis in the way that they like it? Why can't we just submit legislation to repeal the criminalization of cannabis and just let it do its thing? Let the economic growth take place. We have an opportunity. We are a tiny state where we could be an economic mecca for cannabis if we were just hands off with it. Right. If we just, to some degree, didn't grind it into dust with government like we do with everything.
Well, one only has to
they're doing the same things to the firearm dealers and gun stores. Right. These businesses are set up here. They've jumped through more hoops than any business I've ever seen in my life at a gun store. And year after year, the reward they get for staying in Rhode Island and being a business that is loyal to their state, what do they get in return? They get beat over the head with more taxes, more regulations, and more nonsense. And so this isn't just weed, and it's not just guns. It's everything. This is the way the state acts on every issue, and it's a failure. It's a clear failure. It couldn't be any more obvious. The fact that the governor can stand up there and pretend like she's doing something good and people actually buy it blows my mind. Right. That really, you want to talk about the media, really delving into issues? They're heading in the other direction. They're trying to paint this administration as a success, and it's not. It's not a success. It lacks heart. That she doesn't care about people. All she cares about is stacking her record so that she can turn around and use Rhode Island as a step stool to get on the federal level and to do whatever she needs to do for number one. And that's it.
A gentleman by the name of Sean
And the rest of us are just here to be fleeced in the process.
A gentleman by the name of Sean Miser is the policy director now for the Libertarian Party. And part of his job was identifying legislation. And he got to the point a couple of weeks ago where there were, to your point, a couple of thousand pieces of proposed legislation. Now think about that for a second. A couple of thousand pieces. You talk about whack-a-mole. You talk about just out of control legislators. There are a handful of issues to be addressed in this state at this point? Absolutely. Eliminating unfair provisions in the tax code. Absolutely. Despite what a former representative from Warren spent 2 years trying to prove. Are there other issues in the criminal justice system that need to be addressed? Absolutely. But the notion that a couple of thousand pet bills, not the least of which is now the infamous balloon bill, would actually take up the people's time is just disgusting. you've got adults up there who actually feel it's relevant for the General Assembly of the state of Rhode Island to address the catch and release of balloons. And if I could bring up one more.
I mean, if
point,
it's your
okay.
if it's your argument that that's littering, why not just call it littering?
Right, for which we've got tremendous unenforced laws for. And if I could bring up sort of the ultimate sore point, let me hold it up before the camera. Yours and my favorite soda, Yacht Club Soda. YachtClubBottlingWorks.com, one of the sponsors of this show. John, what's on the horizon right now for the third or fourth consecutive year?
What's on the horizon?
With regard to our friends at Yacht Club Soda?
The
soda
I know they
tax.
have seltzer water, so I can drink it.
Right, the soda tax. Yes. The soda
Yep.
The soda tax is alive and well. By the way, I'm about to have a quinine tonic, cold and refreshing, here in the hot studio lights of the GoLocal Broadcast Center. Now, if you could, and I know you've been with me for a while, I appreciate you hanging in there, could explain to me why this is a tax weaponized. You touched on it pretty strongly with regard to social engineering. Why the soda tax, the tax weaponized and aimed at directly perhaps a half a dozen Rhode Island businesses. What are they trying to do there, John?
Well, I mean, it's the same thing we always see from them. Yet again, they're strong-arming businesses. They're they're trying to push an agenda where they think soda's bad, so we want to tax it heavily so people don't use it. The problem with that, once again, is that we're in Rhode Island, and when you tax soda and you try to stop people from using it because it's taxed, all you do is push them into Massachusetts and Connecticut to buy soda. Mm-hmm. And while they're there to buy soda, they'll buy groceries, they'll buy anything else they need to buy. And all you've done is hurt Rhode Island businesses in the process. This doesn't mean, it's just going to hurt Yacht Club Soda. It is going to hurt Yacht Club Soda, no doubt. But it is also going to hurt every grocery store near the border, every convenience store near the border, every restaurant that sells fountain beverages. There's a tax on the syrup for that. Mm-hmm. So you're going to decimate the Rhode Island economy on the borders where it's easy for someone to drive into another state and not pay that tax. We're not just talking pennies here. The tax that they want to put on soda is a very heavy tax for the purposes of deterring people from buying it. Mm-hmm. What that will do is deter them from buying it in Rhode Island. Nothing more.
Right. I mean, would it not be a cruel irony if Yacht Club was forced to set up in Swansea? Perhaps at are you aware of it, like say an empty mall or something that's nearby? Yep. And that we could smuggle in the middle of the night, unlicensed, untaxed, tonic water. Rhode Island.
What about these mom and pop diners and just any restaurant that's a 10 and 15 minute drive from the border? Are you gonna go to a restaurant that's 10 minutes further and for a family of four you paid $20 less for soda?
Time and time again, there's an economic formula. It's called price elasticity. And every single product known to man and woman, there is a price point upon which demand will fall. Or alternatively, there's also a price point for which demand will be directed elsewhere, where the product is available perhaps at an increased cost of acquisition, but at a decreased cost of actual purchase. So ultimately, there's no such thing as a Rhode Island or Massachusetts economy. That's nonsense. Economies don't observe legal borders. Economies observe traffic patterns, individual behavior in the aggregate, and they behave accordingly. So if you're in Warren and you've just come up with 2 or 3 more reasons, hypothetically, of course, to go over to Swansea, which is all of about, a mile away from downtown, 2 miles away from downtown Warren, and a family already under attack by this government because of increased healthcare costs, the cost of finding alternative supplements to their children's education because the delivery of it is so poor in the local school district. If you can find a way to offset that, then you're certainly going to do it. And that's just simply how economies work. It's a pattern of behavior. It's not even really a plan. And quite frankly, it happens organically in direct reaction as well to a variety of economic factors and behaviors.
Well, they admit in this recent push, as well as in other pushes for the soda tax, they actually admit to wanting to tank demand for soda.
Right.
Which, think about what that means. That means that they're intentionally trying to harm businesses.
Right.
If you're saying I'm creating this tax so that people don't buy your products, I mean, come on. That is usually they're throwing haymakers at these companies, kind of, they're using the guise of regulation and safety and all this. With this, they're blatantly saying, well, if you make soda, we want to put you out of business because it's bad for people. That is egregious. That is not what government is for.
And you know what? It's interesting. The fat guy in the golden EIB mic, what's that guy's name, Rush Limbaugh? He came up with probably the only thing I've ever found interesting from him one day when he suggested, and I don't think he used Rhode Island as an example, might have used D.C. or one of the small states. And what he suggested at the time was, in this case, he was talking about cigarettes and the sin tax and this conflict, if you will, between the desire to end the market, but at the same time, the increasing reliance on taxes derived from said market. And he suggested how it would be interesting to see if a couple of the cigarette makers saying, I'll just extrapolate and say in a state like Rhode Island, got together and said, you know what? You're right. We suck. We're terrible human beings. We're not going to, you know what? We're leaving. We're done. We're sorry we're here. We apologize. See ya, but I wouldn't want to be ya. We're no longer going to sell cigarettes. We're all leaving. Every one of us. You don't have to worry about us anymore. You don't have to kick around fill in the blank cigarette manufacturer. What would happen to the state of Rhode Island if that happened?
They would turn around and attack somebody else for their precious revenue.
Right. But you would also probably see a near collapse because of the dependence that these same individuals have on their own little form of economic heroin, and that's the tax money derived from these sin taxes. See, the filthy secret is that on one hand they hate us, and on the other hand they are so dependent on us. You don't get to have a multi-million-dollar budget for something called the JCLS, which is the Joint Committee on Legislative Services, or something of that, which is truly one of the stealth agencies in Rhode Island. That's the agency that supports your Rhode Island General Assembly. With everything from Pernod and shrimp cocktails to, fill in the blank with literally hundreds of patronage jobs. It's a full employment act for lawyers. You don't get to have that if you don't have a host to feed off of. Let me go back to that tumor example. So if you don't have a host mechanism, which is us, the taxpayer, and or the sin, quote, manufacturers, then you simply cease to exist. So again, the behavior, unfortunately at this point, if this budget passes, may need to be to encourage mass departicipation, if you will, in that part of the Rhode Island economy upon which the state depends. And I will kid you not, it would be the collapse, I believe, would be swift and certain. And unfortunately, that may have to be the next angle. I won't use the B word, so I won't say boycott, but simply choose to purchase elsewhere. Many of those same brands. And if Rhode Island persists on relying upon these onerous taxes, then Rhode Island will have to starve or find something else. And that may be the lesson we have to live with at this point.
And I think you were kind of touching on what's known as an equilibrium in tax,
right,
where there's a certain rate you can charge that will be both a deterrent and a financial gain for the state. Mm-hmm. When we talk about taxes that aren't sin taxes, like sales tax or things like that, what these proposals fail to take into account is you can actually, if you're sitting there and you're saying, well, I really, really need revenue from my government, you can actually get more revenue out of a lower rate because of economic activity.
Right.
So the more you wring economic activity out of the state, the higher the rate you have to charge to get that money. Whereas if you lower the rate and you bring in more economic activity, you've now raised the amount of revenue because you have more activity.
Right. And
we have blown past that equilibrium where now we're totally dependent on the rate and not the activity.
Right.
So the businesses that are left here are being faced with exactly what you said. We're going to beat you into submission. We're going to use you as a funding source, and in the process, those businesses will probably pick up and move, or just go out of existence.
Right.
I know if I was a soda company in the state right now, I would tell them, if you put this tax in place, it will put me out of business. I'm going to move my business to Massachusetts, and I will sell soda out of my establishment 300 feet from your border without the tax.
Mm-hmm.
And then what do they get? They get nothing. They didn't get the tax. They lost revenue. So a higher rate got them less revenue. They're geniuses. They're economic geniuses, these people.
In the words of the immortal Judge Smail from Caddyshack, you'll get nothing and you'll like it. No, there's got to be more of that. And it's got to rise up from the citizenry. And the way to do that is for people like you who are activists, economic education. Because getting back to my media comments, it's clear that we'll get none from the current cast of characters. We'll get the scandals after they've broken. We'll get earnest, breathless reporting on the scandals. We'll get the outrage du jour, the outrage porn, as I like to call it, from whomever or whatever stupid issue. A couple weeks ago,
someone might even go to jail.
Right. I mean, last week the state was held breathless for a day or two because students in Cumberland were crossing the street as opposed to going over the bridge. Are you kidding me? Really? And meanwhile, another one of Gina's pet companies went bankrupt over in Quonset Point. Another company that they loaned millions of dollars to, of which it's uncertain whether or not we'll ever see that money again. So to whatever degree outrage porn continues to take up the oxygen in this state, we will not address the core issues of our problems, we'll continue to focus on the symptoms that attack the actual illness. And the illness, of course, is the notion that a government exhibiting central planning, engaging in the use of the weaponizing of a tax system to engage in, for lack of a better term, social engineering, that will continue to destroy and undercut whatever is left of this economy. And all you need to do is look at the borders. Look at Pawtucket, if you must. Newport Avenue.
Yep.
Acres and acres
Cross
and
over
acres.
to North Attleboro.
Right into North Attleboro, perched on the border.
Yep.
Are literally dozens and dozens of stores.
Yep.
Living like a parasite on the Rhode Island economy.
Seekonk and Swansea are the same exact thing.
Yep. And the only reason, quite frankly, you've got continued growth down in the Bald Hill Road area is because you don't have that immediacy of an alternative economy nearby at a lower cost.
Right.
If all of a sudden Eastern Connecticut, they built a couple shopping malls in Eastern Connecticut, guess what? And Connecticut got its act together. The only saving grace for that part of Rhode Island is, quite frankly, is Connecticut's even more of a mess, it would appear, than Rhode Island on a grander scale. They too have their priorities. The notion in this session that we're talking about things like millionaires' taxes, so we're going to target the only people who actually have the ability to engage in capital flight, the only people in the state left who have choices they can make as to where they're going to localize their economic activity, shows you how ignorant, fundamentally, the Rhode Island State General Assembly is. People who have money have choices, plain and simple. People who don't are often the ones left behind. And that, in the case of Rhode Island, sadly, is what the economy is left to grow off of. Government transfer spending, government taxes, government programs. And to the idiots who preach socialism, who clearly have no fundamental understanding of economics, that's just no way to run a country. And sadly, after this special election, they're even more in charge. So,
well, when you or I talk about economic growth, Pat, we're talking about people prospering. When the governor or a lot of the speaker or a lot of these politicians talk about economic growth, they're talking about it from a government standpoint, which is to enrich them.
Right.
This comes in the form of taxes and sometimes regulations with fees associated. So we're not even, when we talk about economic growth, people like you or I or middle-class people or regular people aren't thinking of the same thing that they are. Mm-hmm. They would much rather have their government funding than to allow a local economy to thrive where they can't put their hands on that money. It's there. People have quality of life, but the government can't wrap their fingers around that wealth and use it to fund their precious programs. They know that if they let off the gas, that will happen. They just don't have any interest in doing that because that means they'll have to give up control and allow people to control their own lives.
And that simply won't be allowed to happen, will it, if they have their choice?
No, absolutely not.
And that's what you and I and our next couple of guests are pretty much dedicated to doing, isn't it? So what we have here is a conflict. We have a conflict, a failure of minds to agree. And so, John, what are we going to do about that? Are we going to cave to them? Nope.
Never.
No, we are not. So, again, that's why libertarians, large L or small, are the party of principle. And it's self-ownership, individual liberty, and respect for the ultimate minority of the individual are more important than an immediate short-term wins. As we educate folks, as we bring them into the fold, as we create a level of understanding of what's happened here, at the same time we give them a way to strike back, as it were, that's how you and I and a lot of the people surrounding this program are going to empower people. And we're going to keep at it because, to paraphrase a certain 1960s, 70s actor, they're going to pry our liberty from us from our cold, dead hands, aren't they? So, not going to happen. John, I want to thank you for coming on tonight. I know you've been with us on a lot of issues that we hadn't really spoken about, but you're an articulate voice for liberty. I'd like to hear more of your voice because you're passionate. Just as importantly, you're informed. Just as importantly, you're willing to invest whatever it takes in order to further the cause. Those are three components upon which I and a number of other people involved in the movement can tell you are very difficult to find in any one individual. So I just want to thank you for everything you do, and let's have you back on the show again soon, all right?
Thanks a lot for having me on, Pat. I had a lot of fun.
All right, buddy. John Fennessy, libertary agitator, one-man army. Truly one of the most interesting men alive. Joining us on the coalition to provide an anecdote to situations revolving around Second Amendment legislation, cannabis legislation, and an overall perspective of the economy itself. Again, if I can sum up this exercise we did tonight, it was not really to demonize either side, if you will, of the legislation. When I mean either side, there's clearly a side which is more prone to passage in order to move, quote-unquote, legalization forward. There is another side that John Fennessy articulated, which is to say, let's put the brakes on. Let's analyze the impact of this laws. Let's understand if, in fact, there's more progress than being made, or are we just setting in stone the roots of our own demise? It was a pretty interesting conversation from both, and they'll both be available on podcast tomorrow. So John Fennessy, I hope he's a regular part of the show here. We're going to take a break right now for a couple of minutes. One, for my voice, and two, we've got a couple more people coming on who are now becoming themselves repeat offenders on the show. We're going to provide another perspective on liberty tonight and the guerrilla warfare they're waging on behalf of liberty here in the state of Rhode Island. Folks, we are the coalition, as always, loud and proud, outrage porn-free, civilly disobedient media broadcasting live on the Worldwide Coalition Media Network here at the GoLocal Live Broadcast Center, deep in the heart of the city we love, La Prave. The naked city, the city of 1,000 stories. As I like to describe to my libertarian friends from around the country, There is probably no better place to sin in America, including that little honky-tonk town they call Vegas. No better place to sin than here in La Prove, Providence, Rhode Island. There is something for every taste. And let me tell you, every taste. Tonight it's kind of turning into a little bit of a chilly night. I guess they're anticipating bad weather in the wee hours of the morning, so there's still time to get out and sample some of the fine bistros, restaurants that dot the city of Providence. Not just downtown, but I would implore you to go to places like Thayer Street. But even on a more interesting level, I have been fortunate to find over the last few weeks, the last few months, dozens of restaurants on the west and north end. Broad Street, Chalkstone Avenue, first-generation immigrants bringing their food to our shores as one of the most, on one hand, typical, yet on the other hand, most important steps for first-generation Americans. These folks are all entrepreneurs. They turn out some amazing product, some absolutely amazing product. A restaurant I've gone to a couple times now, right across the street from Rhode Island Hospital, a restaurant called Blaze. Jamaican food, the best jerk chicken I've had here in Rhode Island. Astonishing portions for reasonable prices, served cafeteria style. Folks, you're going to see people emptying from Rhode Island Hospital. No knock on the hospital food, but they're yikes. If you could walk across the street and for a few bucks get a great lunch, that's just one of them. Mi Guatemala on the west side. Everyone knows Los Andes now. Peruvian food over up on Chalkstone. Cambodian food, Vietnamese food, little Italian joints. They dot the city. We are truly blessed that a combination of low rent, influx of folks from around the world dying for a taste of liberty, joined with a university crowd that makes this city a very interesting place. Take some time this weekend, sample it, enjoy it. It's a very special city. Facebook.com/The Coalition Radio, on the Mighty Mighty Twitter, at Coalition_radio, at coalitionradio.us, where you'll find links to our new podcast that is hosted by Spreaker. If you can take a moment, the nuts and bolts of indie media, we don't have a lot of money to spend on promotion and advertising, so we rely on the organic reach that social media allows us. So if you haven't, please take a moment to follow us on Twitter. Please take a moment to like our Facebook page. And please take a moment to go to our YouTube page and to our new Spreaker podcast page. It's critically important to us and helps us deliver, I believe, a unique message to you, the listener, who, as I evidenced earlier today, is so tired of soundbite, knee-jerk, uninformed, quite frankly, lazy media here in Rhode Island, who simply won't take the time or energy to understand the issues, for whom clearly their daily media prep is going to the Drudge Report and reading a couple of articles in the Providence Journal and then milking that for 3 hours. I'm tired of it. You should be too. The last few weeks, when it came to coverage of the Second Amendment debates, when it came to the cannabis debates, when it came to any one of these issues, quite frankly, you and I both should be insulted. Folks, a couple minutes, we'll be right back. And we are back. A little bit of technical difficulties there, but happy to be live again. We are the Coalition, loud and proud, outrage porn-free, civilly disobedient media broadcasting live, as always, on the worldwide Coalition Media Network. Here, broadcasting 90 Way Boston Street at the GoLocal Live Broadcast Center, deep in the heart of the city we love, Providence, Rhode Island. Facebook.com/The Coalition Radio. On the mighty Twitter at Coalition_Radio. And, of course, the mothership at coalitionradio.us. Joining me now, live via the miracle of Skype telephone, is someone who's certainly no stranger to the Coalition. We have always referred to her as well as a repeat offender. Amy Gardner joins us. She has been a warrior, if you will, on the front lines of vaccine mandates. As always, we'll have a little bit of a conversation about that, but she's going to bring us up to date on what's going on with her legislation as she continues to pursue a no HPV mandate here in the state of Rhode Island. Amy, welcome back to the Coalition.
Hey, thank you so much for having me back on.
Yeah, great stuff. I'd like to. There's a tendency by, and the late great Vincent A. Buddy Cianci came up with a name for it. The tendency by media to do a blast on a story and then all of a sudden forget it as if it never existed. And he called it vapor stories. And we certainly don't want your issue to be a vapor story. I saw a poignant quote today from no other than Ron Paul, really the godfather, if you will, of the modern liberty movement, who talked about how Orwell-esque, if you will, the notion of forced vaccinations are. And I thought it was particularly compelling, particularly given your efforts to eliminate that here in Rhode Island. So, first of all, as always, we like to differentiate. Your primary focus in fighting the HPV mandate is, in fact, and please correct me when I'm wrong, not if, but when I'm wrong, your primary focus is to fight the mandate itself. And while you bring up significant issues with the HPV vaccination, equal to your campaign is recognizing the inherent right of a parent and or a child, once becoming an adult, to essentially control their own body's destiny. Now, this has tremendous poignance, if you will, in today's legislative sessions up at Mordor, otherwise known as Halitosis Hall, because clearly the brunt of the abortion rights movement is a control over one's body. Yet, whether we talk about Second Amendment rights, whether we talk about fighting a soda tax, whether we talk about any number of other issues, that same individuals will turn and say, no, the state should control your body. And when we spoke a few weeks ago, that was where we left off. What's transpired since then, and what's the the General Assembly landscape look like right now for you?
Yes, so you are right. The focus is about the mandate and putting a line in the sand, basically. Like the government can recommend things, the government can say this is what we feel is best for you, but when it comes to your body, your body autonomy, your decision should ultimately always matter. Nuremberg Code, the whole nine. So it's a point of saying enough is enough, and the government should not be forcing a decision upon you or your family. And as far as legislation right now, we actually have one where we're opposing it. It's House Bill 5541, and currently we do not have a sister bill on the Senate side to oppose, but we do assume there will be one to surface. This is the bad database tracking bill. This bill is worded as a vaccination tracking database based on how it's being sold from the Rhode Island Department of Health as to why people should support it. And being that a lot of people do support vaccination, they in turn just think that this database would just simply track vaccination, and it's not something to be on the radar, and that is the wrong perception. The wording of this bill specifically states that what could be in this database is anything within the CDC acceptable standard list. Going to the CDC website and figuring out what that list is, it is 6 pages of possible fields of data. That is well beyond vaccinations, and that should alarm people. It's also designed to be an auto opt-in database for every single Rhode Island resident of every age. You get put in it whether you want to be in it or not. There's another huge, serious red flag, and that is not informed consent. Most people don't even realize that the database already exists for minor children, and everybody's kid is already entered into this database, and a lot of people have no idea. Also, HIPAA, federal HIPAA regulations specifically have exemptions for agencies like the Department of Health, meaning once the Department of Health has the data, it is no longer covered by HIPAA laws. They can do as they see fit with that data, and they are not breaking HIPAA laws by doing so. The only way to protect your medical file, your information, and just the fact that it's your privacy, period, is to stop it from even being in the Department of Health's hands. And the only way to do that is to stop the bill and oppose 5541 on the House side. It's such an extreme overreach, and it's not acceptable. It shouldn't be acceptable. And the fact that we even have legislators that presented the bill to find it okay to data mine this much data with an auto opt-in of every single Rhode Island resident, that you cannot delete your file once it's in there, it's mind-boggling and it's horrible.
Who, if you don't mind me asking, and I'm not looking to demonize, well, maybe I am, but we'll keep it polite because you're on tonight. You're one of the few people out there that makes me act like an adult, and we'll just leave it at that. But who is inflicting this on us? And is it coming from a particular wing of the General Assembly? I mean, who woke up? And you know what's astonishing? I mean, I don't know if you've ever. I had this epiphany a couple years ago that an entire room full of adults would wake up one morning, look at this nonsense, and I'm keeping it clean, and think that this was a good idea. So can you give us an idea who thought this was a good idea?
Well, it's the Department of Health lobbying for it, and because it's another government agency, we have found that a lot of legislators won't necessarily question it. They will believe, whatever 6 or 7 sentences is told to them about the purpose and intent of the bill, and they're willing to put their names on it without necessarily questioning it because it's coming from another agency. And sometimes that in and of itself is a reason to question it, because they're bureaucrats. They are not elected officials. They don't have to appease us. We don't have to like what they're doing. They keep their job. We don't vote them out. And so the more power they are given, the less our votes and our legislative choices of who we put in there to be our legislators, the less it matters when they're giving more and more power over to the bureaucrats in the Department of Health and allowing them to have these amounts of data and these decisions and these things. Like, as it is, the Department of Health is one of only a handful in the country that gets to decide which vaccines to mandate for public school inclusion without having to write a bill and have it sponsored through legislation and have it voted upon. The majority of the country writes legislation and votes which vaccines should be required for school inclusion and which ones should not. And in Rhode Island, the Department of Health just adds whichever ones they want, and our State House body gave them that power decades ago.
And here's what's appalling. It's interesting. I'm going to draw a correlation between rights and, in this case, the respective powers of departments. If you were to ask most people what right, what constitutional right was under the most attack, they'd probably, depending on their political background, say either the First Amendment or the Second Amendment. People who watch civil liberties very closely will tell you that it's actually the Fourth Amendment that's under the most attack right now, and how that impacts the First and the Second Amendment in so many different ways. When you look at state government, I think it's fair to say, given what's gone on with the medical cannabis laws in the last few years, and just the overall attack on civil liberties with these databases, you know, the prescription medical database, what you're talking about now with this bad database, that if there was a State Department that wields quietly the most power, whether it be through red flag laws or any one of the different machinations that can put you down as an individual, it is clearly the health department in this state, which is astonishing given what a terrible record they have in being what most people would consider the actual normalized aspects and responsibilities of what people consider the health department to be. I mean, most people think of the health department as an organization that goes around and makes sure that, you know, restaurants are clean and this is happening and that's happening. I mean, our health department, that whole health thing doesn't seem to be a real big priority to them. What seems to be a priority to them is finding new ways to data mine and collect individual information on the individuals, and then finding ways to spin them out to either government's profit or for government control. You've nailed it in the sense that as much as a free market capitalist like me hates the Commerce Corporation, the people I need to be worried about really are the health department, aren't they?
Yeah, and our health department in particular likes to basically put statistics and numbers above the public. And because they have the power that they have in this state, giving them more control than most, and over different things, and now there's also another bill in the State House about the Department of Health having a website that they maintain for clinical trials, which sounds harmless, except for the fact we already have a federal one, and according to this bill, Rhode Island will have this website which will primarily focus on all of New England. So we're going to put more tax dollars towards this website and the maintenance of a website, which technically will cover all of New England for a subset of a website that already covers the entire country if you do want to participate in clinical trials. So now we're going to just, like, we already have a bountiful budget in this state, and now we have a bill in there to have a website for something that already exists federally. Like, they just consistently, it seems to always be money-driven with the Rhode Island Department of Health, which is so mind-boggling because money and actual health never, ever go together. Like, if it's money-driven, chances are it's not health-driven. So they like to, I listen in to a lot of the CDC conferences and the meetings within the CDC for different health-related issues, especially when it comes to database tracking, websites, and vaccinations. Those are the three things that I particularly put effort into watching. And the Department of Health will boast their statistics, their numbers. Oh, look, we did this and we got that. We did this and this. But they're always not bothering to reference the actual health. For instance, since my main fight is reversing the mandate of the HPV vaccine, using some data relevant to that, the Department of Health boasted that we had the highest HPV vaccination rates in the country, and this was such a great thing, and they did such a great job. Well, they didn't do a good job. What they did is they mandated it, and they made people think that they didn't have a choice. That's not something to be proud of. You didn't present a product that people felt the want to have so much that you had a higher rate of acceptance than the rest of the country. You created a situation where people thought they didn't have a choice, and then you boasted about your rates. That's not true health. Not to mention, the Department of Health admits they do not track HPV cases. If you have tested positive for HPV, the Rhode Island Department of Health doesn't track that.
I was about to ask you that just as kind of on a whim. So they're more interested in tracking government compliance as a health department than they are in actually tracking whether or not there are pathogens or illnesses coursing through Rhode Island society.
Correct. Yeah, we don't track the very disease that we're boasting we have high vaccination rates for. Well, who cares if we have high vaccination rates if we can't even show that we even had any serious rates in this state for the disease to begin with? Never mind the fact that we're talking about something that is spread by intimate contact and not just casually being in the same room as somebody. So there's a whole nother ball game right there.
So I got to tell you, kiddo, at this point, I've been doing this for about 5 or 6 years. It's pretty hard to kind of catch me up like this, but I'm still here you have an example where the product of government is seen as actually seen as being government itself, not actually improving the quality of individual lives. So you can go chapter and verse on the efficacy of the actual medicine, if you will. Right. You can go chapter and verse on this, but we really have no freaking idea whether there is any efficacy whatsoever in a mandatory vaccination program that the state of Rhode Island, for whatever reason, has committed continuing resources.
Yep.
If I can quote you immortal, holy shnikes.
Yeah, we don't track it. We didn't ever track it, but we mandate it for school inclusion when you can't even spread it in a casual classroom environment. It's the government using our public schools as strongholds to get what the end result they want is. That has nothing to do with public health. If it was truly public health, you wouldn't attach it to school attendance when you can't spread it in a classroom. You would be doing true, informed campaigns about the HPV disease itself. And if you did a true, informed campaign, most people wouldn't be getting the vaccine anyways, because 90% of all HPV cases clear in the body themselves within a 2-year period. And all of the cancers that HPV has any slight association to are extremely slow growing and would be caught long before you actually had a cancer diagnosis if you are having regular doctor's appointments and maintaining your health properly. So maybe if you choose to skip pap smears and skip doctor's appointments and you choose not to participate in regularly checking up on your health, you might choose you want the vaccine because you don't do the other steps available to you. But based on the other steps available, we have no data that shows as the vaccine is actually a beneficial necessity.
Oh, all right. So this entire crisis of confidence and of civil liberties is completely created by government for the purposes of really one thing, which is maintaining power.
Yeah, I mean, that's one way to look at it. It's definitely there's the whole concept of the HPV vaccine specifically, and the mandate, and the whole marketing campaign, everything surrounding it. The more I'm 4 years now of digging into it and seriously like reading studies and learning. The whole thing is so incredibly mind-boggling. None of the dots connect. It doesn't add up. Currently, Merck, the company that makes the HPV vaccine, is in court because there is 7, I think it's 7, maybe 6 different high-end lawyers, including Kennedy Jr., have taken Merck to court because the science that they submitted to the FDA to get this vaccine approved does not add up. Literally, it doesn't show what Merck says it shows when you dissect the scientific data. Merck is in court over it right now.
And has anyone got a handle on just how much money Merck makes off of this?
Merck is the #1 vaccine manufacturer in the United States, and they are in the billions of profit over vaccinations. Right. And the HPV vaccine is a 3-shot series within a 6-month period, and approximately, it depends, it varies throughout the country, but it's approximately $215 per shot vaccination, putting you at over $600 for all 3 shots, which makes it the most expensive of the vaccinations.
And so while we or the government claims outrage at the rising cost of insulin, and while the government claims outrage at individual pharmaceutical companies raising the price of their niche medicines, they are completely willing to be complicit in this sort of bizarre obsession with the HPV virus.
Yeah, it's mind-boggling to me. I mean, if it was truly about our health, our Department of Health would be pulling a mandate to get a vaccine that is currently in legal trials because their science doesn't prove what they gave to the FDA. So literally the evidence is not there to support what the marketing and promotions say, and our health department is still pushing and still holding on to a mandate for 7th graders instead of saying, oh, you know what? We do care about the public's health. Oh, Merck is being held in court right now to prove about the safety and efficacy of this vaccine. We should hold off until this court ruling tells us what comes of this. But that's not what our Department of Health is doing. This is not revolving around health. We don't even know how many HPV cases are in the state of Rhode Island for the virus. There's over 120 strains of the virus. The vaccine covers 9.
It's almost as if they're in a hellish rush to get the law in place before the fraud underlying it, my opinion, by the way, is revealed. If the fraud of this was revealed, then they couldn't possibly, or would have a great deal more difficulty involved in actually supporting the law. So it's a fraud, plain and simple. It's a crime, I believe, and these are my words. I always try not to have my rhetoric confused. My rhetoric can get a little heated. But what they're doing essentially is it's this make-believe.
It's like a sleight of hand, basically.
Yeah, make-believe.
Here, look over here. This is what we want you to do. Hey, don't look at over here at what there is factual evidence that does not support what we're saying over here. And
essentially, I mean, it confuses me because I always try and follow the money. I mean, what's the motivation here? Is there, I guess I've seen.
Well,
go ahead, buddy.
Through years of digging, we actually found it in the first year, but the year that the HPV vaccine was signed, I should say. So it was signed in 2014 to become effective in 2015 for those 7th graders. In 2014, the year that it was signed, is the same year that the Department of Health received over $630,000 grant to market and promote the HPV vaccine. They received over $500,000 to market and promote a specific vaccine, and they were only a couple of Department of Health in the country that got this grant. Now, my guess, but this is just an educated guess, and I don't actually know for sure, is that in order to be eligible for future similar grants, they had to show back to the CDC and the ACIP and the people that they report to with their vaccination numbers, they had to show that they actually increased their rates after receiving the grant. Well, what better way to show that you increased your rates than mandating it?
Right.
So now our rates are increased, showing we have a higher number of people, so making the Department of Health look like they so effectively used their grant money, giving them the ability to be eligible for future grant money. That is the epitome of corruption, basically, because now we have incentive for an agency to make a decision upon the populace that is based on money for the agency versus actual health benefit to the populace.
Actual science. Is there any, I mean, from what you can tell, is there any other vaccinations right now that the Rhode Island Department of Health has just kind of obsession with? I mean, or is this just so completely out of character?
The flu shot, every year it's, oh no, oh no, oh no, get your flu shot, don't forget to get your flu shot, and it seems like every year the flu shot push is more and more intense, and obviously the flu shot gets reconfigured every year. That's not something that is consistently the same every year. So, but yeah, the HPV and the flu shot are the two major marketed ones. Those are the ones that are pushed the most. And the flu shot is even pushed on pregnant women by our own Department of Health. And what is so incredibly troubling about that is a two-part thing. Number one, if you call the manufacturer of the flu shot and you look at the manufacturer insert, it specifically states it has never been tested on pregnant women. And then the manufacturer, when you call them, says, we do not recommend, we don't have any idea if it has any impact on the fetus or not. Then the FDA was brought to court and they settled out because of allowing the recommendation of it for pregnant women when there is zero, literally zero data of whether or not it's safe for the fetus to do it during pregnancy. And the FDA settled out saying, yes, we actually have nothing. We have zero pieces of information to say that this should actually be recommended. And our own Department of Health will put out that don't forget to get your flu shot when you're pregnant. There's literally zero data that supports that. And so more and more times it's like, excuse me, like, there's not a problem with people getting vaccines. People want to get vaccines, that's fine. But the fact is our Department of Health is putting out information and marketing for things that there is not scientific data to even back the claim.
So our Department of Health, and you'll excuse my language on this, but I can't think of anything more apt, less provocative this time, have essentially become vaccine pimps. They pimp vaccine for a couple of folks, and you know, the flu vaccine, big money. You know, health, you know, very often my understanding is it's reimbursed by health insurance. to large chains, CVS, all these companies either use use the flu shot as a loss leader to get customers in the door, or you've got these organizations going out in large scale doing them at companies. The implication being, if you don't get the flu shot, well, sometimes if you're an educational professional, it's not an implication. The requirement that you get this flu shot, or you simply won't be employed, or your employment opportunities will be limited. So you've got this, for lack of a better term, the health department are pimping these things, and
and the flu shot is a failure. Anything else besides the flu shot coming out with statistics like that literally never is more than 40% effective. On average, is 20% effective, based on estimations, because they never 100% actually know. So based on estimations, it's never more than 40% effective, average of 25% effective. Anything else in our world, that is considered a failure. And yet we push it and push it and push it. And then the Department of Health says, well, you might still get the shot, but then it will reduce your symptoms. I'm sorry, but that sounds counterproductive. If you're reducing symptoms, that means you're still going to go into public. You're going to think you have a common cold, and you're more likely to spread the influenza to others. Whereas if you don't have your reduced symptoms, you know what you have, you stay in, or if you have to leave the house, you do cover your face or do things to reduce the spread of germs. And I feel like you're completely counterproductive if you are willingly admitting this might not work, but it will at least reduce your symptoms. Well, then aren't you just encouraging more people to go out into the populace thinking they have a common cold when really they're spreading something more than the common cold? That, to me, that's counterproductive, but that's my personal opinion.
Whew. No conversation of the HPV mandate, of course, would be complete if we didn't take a moment to reinforce some of the issues that have occurred when the HPV is actually utilized. What have been some of the side effects in, well, air quotes here, unanticipated, unintended side effects of the HPV virus?
The big, huge marketing is cervical cancer. They market that it's a cancer prevention vaccine. However, if you look at the FDA paperwork that got the vaccine approved, it was approved for marketing cancer prevention simply because patients that have been diagnosed with cervical cancer did also show signs of having the HPV virus. There's nothing in the scientific studies and trials of using the vaccine in the trials that nothing shows it's actually going to prevent any cancer. It was approved for marketing to say that because there is a correlation to some cancer diagnoses to also getting diagnosed with HPV. So the big thing is this cancer, cervical cancer prevention, with, again, the data not backing that, and that's one of the reasons for the current court case against Merck. But there's some throat cancers associated. There's some genital warts that are associated to HPV virus. But the majority of HPV viruses are asymptomatic. They do nothing to you. You have no indication that you even have it, and your body fights it and puts it dormant, and you go on. This has been normal. HPV has been a normal part of society for a very long time, and the word epidemic was not connected to HPV until after there was a vaccine on the market.
Wow. it's staggering to think that of all the failed governmental agencies within the state of Rhode Island, the Department of Transportation, failure, Commerce Corporation, failure, that somehow, the Department of Business Regulation, who knows, Department of, it's staggering to think that the Department of Health could actually be arguably its most significant failure, both on a moral and philosophical level, as well as, analyzing, efficacy at any sort of level. What's the current? I know we just spoke a few weeks ago, but this is the time of year when the magic happens. What's the current status? First of all, on the bad database bill, when is where is that in the food chain?
We had a hearing Wednesday of last week on the House side, and we had a good amount of people show up, approximately 45 people showing in opposition to the bill that signed in on the sheets to oppose the bill, and I'd say maybe 10 or 11 signed in favor of the bill, multiple of those being employees of the Department of Health.
Yep.
And one thing in particular that I personally pointed out, as you were just saying, failure, the sponsor of the bill is McNamara, who is also the chair of the committee that hears the bill. And he presented the bill stating, like the pharmacies giving out the flu shots and the pneumonia shots and etc. for the adults, and then some of the older adults going to their doctors and not remembering what they necessarily got at the pharmacy. He was saying that this bill enables the database so that they would be able to check and see if somebody already got the vaccine so that it didn't get duplicated. And that they basically, these agencies were not, or these doctors' offices and pharmacies, etc., are not efficiently talking to each other. So when I testified, that's exactly what I pointed out. I said, I'm going to refer back to your opening statement. So why is it falling on the back of every Rhode Island resident that we have our data auto-enrolled and data mined into a database? Because you just admitted we have a system that is broken. It's not efficiently talking to each other. It's not efficiently making what is supposed to happen. So instead of fixing the system that is in place by maybe, removing the pharmacies from being a place that you get vaccines, and maybe you only have to do it at your doctor's office, or some way and somehow make them work more efficiently, but you are leaving an already broken system alone to stay broken, and instead you decide the way to fix it is to enact a database which can data mine many, many fields more than just vaccinations, and the rest of the state has to be auto-enrolled into it and have no option. Like, that's not okay. And that's what my testimony was outlining the failure in the current system, which is being given as a reason why you should want this database. And to me, that's the exact reason why you should not want the database. If the current system doesn't work, why are we adding to more things for them to keep track of instead of making them fix what's already in place?
Wow. Whew. So
the current thing with the bill is held for further study, which all bills in Rhode Island are the very first time they come to committee. So we need everybody to contact their legislators, their personal legislators of their district, to say that they do not support this bill. If you do not know who your legislator is, the Gatsby Project has graciously created a page in support of what we're fighting for, that people can enter their address, and it will automatically come up with who your legislator is and an email that you can choose to click and send. So you can go to gatsbyproject.com/contact, and it's that simple, and you enter your address. It tells you who your legislator is and comes up with an email, and you can send it right off. You can also email the committee that this is held in further study with via 2019.nohpvmandateri.com, and you will have the ability to email the whole committee. So that way it's very easy. You don't have to come up with all your own wording. I mean, of course you can, but we have tried to make it as easy as possible for people to contact and send information to make sure legislators know we oppose this, and it's not okay to be auto-enrolling residents in doing this. I mean, it's one thing for the database to exist, and if, for instance, the senior citizens, they did want to sign themselves up so that they don't have to worry about keeping track of whatever, and it's in there for them. If they want to do it, that's different. But enrolling everyone with 6 pages worth of CDC-approved possible data fields, that's not okay.
Well, so, of course, as you point out, usually the first time a bill is heard, it's held for further study. The last year or so, there have been a few examples of that where it was held for further study, then experienced a magical rebirth. So it's unfortunately never okay either for Rhode Islanders to let up their guard with this crowd. And
yes, definitely. That's why everybody needs to know to send those emails and do that contact, because it could come back up on the calendar at any time, and if it comes back up on the calendar, it can end up going to the floor and getting voted on by the whole House body, and that's why all those legislators need to know that we do not support this, and we as citizens are not okay with our data being automatically put in a database, especially one that, when it's held by an agency such as the Department of Health, is under exception and no longer even under HIPAA laws. So there's serious, even the ACLU testified against this bill.
No, that's
and then and then on the positive side of things, I'm just going to throw a couple bill numbers out there. Hopefully people can choose to check them out and write them down. Or again, the 2019.nohpvmandateri.com. You can also email on any bills, but there's
one of the things I'm going to ask you to do.
H5165 support. Senate bills 300, 303, 213 support. They're all good bills that currently have not come up for a date for a hearing yet. The bad one is the one that did come up for a hearing a week and a half ago, and so we still need to make sure we're contacting legislators so they know if it comes up for a vote that we don't want them voting for it.
So one of the things I'm going to ask you to do, because we're a team here, we will be circulating this podcast this weekend all over the interwebs, as my good friend John Laughlin would say. If you could, I know you're one of the hardest working people alive. You got family, you got all these things. You can write up maybe a paragraph that we can add on as an addendum, as a front piece to the circulation of this, and just ask people exactly where to go, and what bills to lobby against, and what bills to lobby for, and hopefully we'll generate some additional activity. I mean, the challenge for Rhode Islanders, for folks who are not activists like yourself or myself or a number of the people that we've had on the air tonight, is simply to keep up with all of these exigent tragedies, dramas, bills that await us. I mean,
It is. It's so difficult, and that's why it's actually great that we have, for instance, what do we have, like 4 different groups that watch the gun bills and the Second Amendment stuff, and then there's, different groups and there's a group that watches like educational bills and things that specifically impact the schools and the things with the schools. And so there's different people out there that are specifically watching different topics, because there's literally thousands of bills that go through our state house for some of the most benignly minuscule, foolish things sometimes.
balloons.
That it's yeah. so it's so hard for any average person to be watching all of it. So that's why definitely connect with the activists that are watching the things that are important to you, and making sure you're on their email lists and connected to that stuff, so you can know about the topics that are important to you. Because I know with the amount of work that I do in the specific field that I focus on, there's other things that are important to me too, but I depend on the other activists in those other fields to inform me, because I can't do the amount of work I do in my field and then also be watching the other stuff. So we all depend on each other to keep each other informed, definitely.
Right, and there are nights at the State House where we all depend on each other from keeping each other from passing out, because it's, if folks have never testified, one of the things they need to understand is, the bill will be listed as being the testimony will be starting after the rise of the House. Now, typically that's about 3:30 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And the rise of the House and, the housekeeping of the General Assembly is brought up while they're all down in the well in the amphitheater, if you will, and the Christians like us are outside being ready to be fed to the lions. And they'll go through whatever nonsense they go through, solemnization of marriages, this bill, that bill, which is, to acknowledge somebody's brother-in-law getting his plumbing license or whatever it is they do. And then they'll, take a break and they'll work their way up to the committees. Now, I don't want to be that guy who always denigrates individual hardworking efforts. I have watched over the last couple of weeks. I've spent a couple of quality evenings at House Judiciary, and I have seen Representative Craven, who I probably disagree with, on more things than I disagree with, but I've seen him and a handful of other legislators literally sit out these multi-hour meetings, and I give him a lot of credit, because on all of the issues, whether it was the gun issues, whether it was some of the other some other general issues before Judiciary, he was there for the entire freaking time, listening, engaging. And so while I may disagree with him politically, I don't doubt for a moment his sincerity and his work ethic. And there are other people who are hardly ever there. And it's frustrating, because what will happen is you'll get, I've almost got it down now with the gun lobby. I get there about 8:30, 9 o'clock, and I'm only there for a couple hours. I feel terribly for the people who start there at 3 o'clock in the afternoon and don't get out till 1 o'clock in the morning. And so you will sit there, and possibly, I believe, one of the biggest insults of government is you will sit there to testify, and you will have to listen to 2 or 3 hours from the governmental experts. And then what happens is, when they're all done, and it's time for the great unwashed, that is the activists like Amy, myself, and dozens of heroic Rhode Islanders who, a lot of people put in a lot of time. The minute it's time for them to testify, Amy, what happens? The experts get up and leave, and they just walk out. And I called out a few people at the 2A assembly the other night, because they were the folks in the red shirts, and they're entitled to their opinion. It is that's how government works. But the minute they were done, they couldn't even be bothered listening to the opinions of anyone else. And they all cited they had this reason or that reason, and I just told them that they were lazy intellectually. They were offended by that, and I said, good, because you should listen to the opposition, just A, from a practical level, and B, to understand that other people have other opinions in this. And it's just insulting to me how often folks like you are, if it wasn't for the the interwebs, if we didn't have the ability to circulate this, the opinions of informed activists like yourself, government has no interest in circulating your opinion. You're a problem to them. You represent a roadblock, and for which you have my eternal gratitude. So, as always, I commend you on your level of effort. Like I said, if you can, kind of like inside baseball here, if you can somehow tonight or tomorrow morning get me just a paragraph so I can front end the podcast tonight so that people can get a snapshot even if they don't have a time to listen to the whole podcast, that would be great. Because I got to tell you, you've laid it out like clockwork. And I'm looking at the variety of bills you have to face, and my head is spinning. And I like this stuff. They've got you coming. I mean, the same thing with the 2A people. They've got, 8, 10 bills. Again, the Libertarian Party policy director printed out, there were over 2,000 bills being considered right now. How 2,000 bills that range from the sublime to the ridiculous, from exigent and critical issues like vaccination mandates and gun grabbing to to all of it, to all the madness. So I got to wrap it up now. But Amy, first of all, thank you for jumping in. We had a guest cancel at the very last minute, so you're entirely dedicated to your cause, and I'm grateful for you jumping in tonight. And let's continue to get the word out, and God bless you for what you do.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me on, and I'll definitely get that information off to you.
All right, buddy. Thanks very much. Amy Gardner, she, of course, is of the no HPV mandate, but also acting as a watchdog, literally on your Rhode Island Governmental Health Department. Oy. Pretty disturbing stuff. We're going to wrap it up tonight. It's been a full evening. Folks, you have been listening to The Coalition. And we are, as always, outraged, putting free, civilly disobedient media. As always, we broadcast live on the Worldwide Coalition Media Network here at the GoLocal Live Broadcast Center. As always, right in the heart of Sin City, Providence, Rhode Island, the Naked City. We told several stories tonight, and as always, by committed citizen activists who are simply unwilling to accept the status quo, unwilling to accept, quite frankly, the pablum that they're being served by either the government, by the mainstream media, and you've heard it here. We don't do conspiracy theories here. We're emotion-free. As emotional as these issues are, you'll get served up nothing but facts here from people who are subject experts. Facebook.com/The Coalition Radio, on the mighty Twitter at Coalition_radio, and on the mothership at coalitionradio.us, where you will find links to our YouTube page, where we hope you subscribe, and I hope you start to follow our new podcast, where you'll see breakdowns of tonight's show. Folks, next week we have already packed. We've got 4 guests lined up on literally everything. You'll see more about it as the week goes along, but we hope and we know that you can spend your Friday nights or your podcast hours just about anywhere with thousands of choices. We're grateful that occasionally you choose to spend them with us. Stay tuned. We'll see you next week.